All right, so everyone, welcome. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. So you can have your camera on or off. There will be some periods of times where I'm going to open it up and ask for questions. You don't have to yell it out if you don't want to. You can put it in the chat. I tend to like a little bit of back and forth when necessary, but I know with Zoom it can be very hard to do. And to be honest, most of this is going to be a bit of a ambient talk as opposed to an active workshop. We are really assigned about 45 minutes for this. The concept of harm and discomfort and their intersection can be a PhD and multiple PhDs. And I'm not going to pretend that I will cover the breadth of everything and everyone will leave with that PhD after a 35-minute session. But what we are going to do is kind of introduce these topics for some of you, or kind of delve into it a bit for others, and especially place it in the context of COVID and the hospitality industry in Canada going forward into the reopen. So first I'll start with myself. My name is Christina Veira. I am the GM and one of the partners at Mordecai in Toronto, Ontario. Bar slash restaurant slash private karaoke space that had the beautiful kismet of opening 6 weeks before global lockdowns. We are very excited for reopen, but to some extent it could almost be thought of as our true grand opening because of all the starts and stops and the fact that people haven't really been inside. When I'm not doing that, I am also a hospitality educator and programmer. I teach with Wine and Spirits Education Trust, so I teach spirits. I'm in the process of starting my own school, which will offer Wine and Spirits Education Trust certifications, as well as other courses that I believe to be really helpful towards just hospitality professionals, mostly because I fell in love with hospitality when I was about 18. So 14, 15, I don't know how old I am anymore, years ago. And I've always felt it to be this great professional exercise, but I felt that even in our own ecosystem of hospitality, we rely a lot on almost like stories and mythology, and we often don't give tools to people to really go for professional development or to have those stepstones. And as a result, sometimes, and that's not to say only formal education can do that, but as a result, sometimes it really makes it hard for people to break into the industry or to have upward mobility because we are so stuck in our personal, basically who we know and who taught that person. And often we rely too much on the idea that I respect that person where they work, so you must be a great person to be employed at my place of work, which means that we're really only hiring a small group of people who know each other and not really allowing what other professions do, which is you can show your qualifications in conjunction with your experience and be able to essentially go from place to place with some small movement. So that's kind of about me. I'm really happy that Spirited Sessions from Sovereign asked me if I would do a talk. And when they reached out to me, I wasn't too sure what I would do. And I did ask them, can it be really about anything that I think is relevant, or do you want me to talk about like fun with Scotch? Because as I mentioned, I'm a spirits educator. I could do fun with Scotch, but I also really wanted to talk about this subject. So I really want to thank Sovereign actually for being a spirits importing company that would allow a talk that really isn't going to talk about spirits, but I think is going to be really relevant to everyone. So I'll start at the beginning. To those of you who are best with notes, I will be putting different slides over the next week on my Instagram. I'll be putting them in the feed as well. I know if any of you follow me, I tend to do a lot of stories and sometimes those get lost to the ether. I'll be doing them as slides. So if you need to revisit them, and if you need to revisit, share, if you have questions, it's just going to be a little bit more tangible. Personally, I don't find Zoom is not perfect. It's hard to have closed captions. The interface doesn't always work well with PowerPoint next to a face. And for today, I'm just going to talk to you, but I'll put everything out over the next few days online. So this topic is called Who Hurt You? Hopefully everyone, or a lot of you got that that's kind of like a meme reference. It is a reference to basically what can often be a sardonic or dismissive response to people, often when someone thinks that you've overreacted. Maybe Starbucks is out of your cream, and normally that wouldn't be a big deal. And then someone has, and then all of a sudden it's a big meltdown for you. And then maybe somebody might dismissively be like, who hurt you? Often as a way to be like, you're not actually responding to this, or could you be responding to this, or is it something else deeper? I wanted to talk about that specifically because one thing that has really come up time and time again in many conversations, be it on the conversation about just reopening and safety, be it on conversations about race, gender equality, labor, is often this idea where these conversations are getting shut down often prematurely because somebody feels uncomfortable. But the problem is often many people are feeling uncomfortable, and often many people are acting from places of hurt, but they're often being equalized. So when I'm talking about harm versus discomfort, where I want to start off is in this I wanted to see where everyone was from because we're in Canada, but I think it's almost like a very Canadian approach in like the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, and probably beyond in education, where we told people that if something made them uncomfortable, it was inherently wrong. This is a really good way to teach consent to a 5-year-old because typically the way in which they've gone through their life, they're in an ideal situation, they are being very cared for, and they should be able to have something that happens. If it triggers their idea that something is wrong, we are supposed to be giving them that autonomy to be able to advocate for themselves or to tell somebody else. So we say, if something makes you uncomfortable, it's bad. The problem with this statement, and especially when I say in Canada, you can flatten what society is, but it is pretty fair to say compared to in a lot of other countries, we tend to be a relatively conflict averse country. And in hospitality, you see this to the extreme. You see this in how we want the customer to always be right. Often what we think about the customer always being right or ending a good customer service interaction is the idea that there is no conflict and that the customer is getting what they want from it, and that whatever happens, and we often don't talk about the other actors, which could be in the case of, let's say, Starbucks, not only the staff member interacting or the manager who oversees them or the owner of the place, but also everyone around, people who are there for the interaction, especially if it's conflict. We don't always talk about what happens to them and how they place and their needs are placed in it. So when you're talking about hospitality, where we're often told that all conflict is bad, where that tends to get to, and when coupled with the idea that if you feel uncomfortable, there's a harm being done, is we often are getting into situations where we have what we are pretending to be very flat, good situations where because there's no conflict, everyone's being treated well, but in fact, we're actually perpetuating usually systemic harms. I want to bring this up because when we center the idea of conflict or somebody being uncomfortable as inherently being something that needs to be fixed, what typically happens, and has happened a lot in especially hospitality, but in any sphere, is we then trade power to the person who's typically from a position of power already. We are more likely to make those in authority situations feel uncomfortable if we challenge them than vice versa. And for here, I just kind of want to take a break because I want to just talk about COVID in general. Some of you may have, I know a couple of you may have at one point in time over the last year gone to something I did last year called In My Feelings, where we talked about our feelings. It was mostly hospitality people, but it wasn't only hospitality people. And it was really just supposed to be this like open place to discuss not only how you felt in that moment, but really just to like process. And it didn't always have to be sad feelings or angry feelings. It could just be like processing anything can take some time. One thing that when you are reopening your place, or if your place is already reopened, again, I'm in Ontario where we're in the very slow steps to reopen. We've had indoor dining closed for 340 plus days. Some of you are in places where you've actually probably been more modified service than full closures and opens. Either way, you can think of COVID as a grand disruptor to the world. And I like to think of it actually as a global trauma. It's something that, generally speaking, when you approach anyone, ideally you approach them not thinking you know their life story by looking at them. This is also something that is a bit counter to how we usually train people in hospitality. We often train people to be like, look at this person, let's see how quickly you can get them to the yes and the upsell. That's not always true. But with COVID, what's interesting is regardless of what people's privileges are on the chart, you actually at present don't know how it has directly affected them, but we have a few assumptions. We know that COVID would have affected almost everyone's mobility, or would have affected everyone's mobility, because it's essentially affected anything you can do. It's affected which stores you can go to. It's affected how you can pay when you go into that store. For many people, especially in hospitality, it's affected their work. Even if it hasn't affected their ability to work, it's often affected the structure of how they work. I remember talking to friends in the first couple of months who are a married couple, and they said that it's very weird to realize that you've never heard how your family, or sorry, your husband or wife talks to each other when they're at work. And you only really realize that when they're both working from home. So COVID as a global disruptor means that in some ways it has traumatized many people, but it's also taken away a lot from different people. As we reopen, what's going to be something that's going to be really important for all of us to remember is between ourselves, our staff, and all of our guests, we are essentially dealing with people who are in the middle still of a trauma and have processed it in many different ways, often likely very unhealthily. And this is something that was probably always good to think about when you're engaging with guests or when you're engaging with staff members. You typically don't know what someone's going through. And a great example of that is the heightened conversation around mental health in the industry. Our industry can be quite ableist. It's very hard to even work in hospitality if you're not, quote unquote, like very able-bodied. It's very hard to do almost any job if you can't lift 30 pounds repeatedly, you can't work on your feet for a minimum of 8 hours a day, likely much more if you don't have a ton of energy, which is why we skew quite young, overall quite thin, quite gender normative. This whole range is like where we skew to. And mental health was often, and is still by many people, only given lip service too, because it's not visible, or it's typically not visible in the way that we want it to be visible until it's a little bit too late. And often we don't give it that space. When we're talking about COVID, I think what should be what would help everyone in the reopen is to really center the idea that anyone at any point in time that we're interacting with, including our staff, might be coming at it from a place of loss, because they probably did lose something, even if it was just their mobility, even if it was their income. It could have been a family member, it could have been multiple family members, it could have been opportunities. This is incredibly important because when we are going into our reopen, and I know this is a bit of a preamble, what I think we all need to center in our reopen is this idea that, one, we will all engage in conflict. It is not going to only be smooth sailing because you have a really great reopen plan. And there will be times when people will be hurt. And we will also have to engage with the idea that there will be times when we could have potentially hurt other people, and we have to be aware of it. I've noticed a lot of rhetoric in the reopen where people are very passionate about the idea that they have a really great PPE strategy, they have a really good COVID safety plan. And also, just as a side, if any of you have questions, you can either put questions in the chat or you can put it privately to me. I'll see it. And if you put it privately to me, I'll make sure not to say your name aloud, especially if there's anything in there that you have any questions about, that you kind of want to hide your identity from. So yeah, when we go into reopen, one thing that we have to get away from, that we always need to get away from in hospitality, was the idea that, I guess, this toxic positivity, that it'd be good vibes only, that it would be us never having a fight. We'd always have the best crew, everyone would get along, and it'd be very smooth sailing. And I say this because realistically speaking, that is not going to happen. If you enter work thinking that likely everything's going to be the same as those fantasy days you had pre-COVID, that's probably going to be, you're going to be disillusioned quite quick when someone doesn't want to wear a mask or doesn't understand the 20 new bylaws from your city, or you're feeling really stressed because you just had I just got a puppy. So let's say you just had a surprise pet bill, but now your work has to shut down because you have a positive COVID case from somebody who you work with. So that means that a lot of your income is gone like that, and you have no control over it. There's going to be people who are going to come in and they've had 16 months of traumatic experience, and you can't ask people when they came in, did you lose anyone? How much were you personally affected by it? But it's good if you just assume that that's going to happen, and you're going to assume it's going to lead to different issues down the road or potentially different conflicts. But then you also assume that it's not about avoiding conflict. It's about how you engage with the conflict when it happens. Over the years in hospitality, I've often, when I'm training staff, really try to focus not so much on how do we get away from having conflict and interaction, a tense discussion, but how we do it healthily. And there's many ways to do it healthily. There's a lot of books on how you do it. One thing that I wanted to focus on is how we, as with our staff and with ourselves, differentiate between if something is making us uncomfortable and if something is actually harming us. And that's going to be very important for the next bit, because as I said, there will always be conflict, but there will also typically be a lot of things that will make us uncomfortable, because just the way in which you're going to work for the next bit will be that. And this is especially important as you work with more and more people on the intersections, because for some people, COVID in itself was incredibly traumatizing. For other people, it's not just that. It could be you have staff, or you yourself are Indigenous, or you're Black, or you're Asian, or you are immune compromised and have been specifically affected even deeper by COVID, or have long COVID and complications. And I was just looking at a question. There's a whole range in which, when you talk about everything that happened, is going to specifically and deeply affect some demographics more than others. Personally, as you can probably tell, if you have your cameras on and you're not listening to my voice as an ambient podcast, I am a Black woman. And I would say that the last year has deeply not only affected how I've approached and thought of hospitality, but even how I've thought about how hospitality places and thinks about Black people. Because as we've had more and more conversations about pay rates, about racial equality, about sexual equality, about inclusion, one thing happens pretty regularly, which is eventually, if you have a system that is essentially been built to help and uplift a certain group, skewing more white, skewing more male, skewing cisgendered, anything that's going to change it is going to be something that will inherently challenge it, which will be something that will inherently, to some people who are benefiting from a system, feel like harm, because it will put them in a position where they are less comfortable. If you are somebody who wants to advocate in your spaces for equity, if you are wondering why your places don't look more even between all the different demographics of your city and your country, one place to start is really, how do I navigate these conversations, and at what point do I feel uncomfortable? And it's not about getting rid of that, it's about identifying your edge curve. So I'll take a pause here, and I'm going to ask, has anyone heard of the term edge curve? Do they know what that is? You can put a little reaction emoji, or if you want to volunteer it, you can. I'll wait a couple minutes. I'm good at waiting in the Zoom, and then I'll kind of. But if anyone wants to, I know it's pretty heavy so far. Your turn. So, all right. So an edge curve is essentially when you are hitting up on something that not only is it a conversation or a topic that might make you feel a bit out of your depth, but it's something that you're having potentially a hard and more than hard, like a truly difficult time wrapping your head around, even when you want to be quote unquote on the right side of it. Different people have very many different edge curves. Generally speaking, no one is born or created woke or perfect. So I will identify a couple of my edge curves and why I think they are my edge curves. And it doesn't mean that they are a hall pass for you to not grow. It's more that it means that it's a place for you to identify where you do need to grow. One, and it's something that I actually did touch on earlier, is being ableist. I started working in hospitality in my late teens. Generally, and I'm a tall person, I'm not particularly big. Generally, almost everywhere I've worked front of house, I've been one of the women who take up the most space, even though I actually don't take up that much space. I've worked very physical jobs, especially when I transitioned into events. You have to be able to unload and load up a truck and all that fun stuff. And as you grow in the industry, as you gain more people that you're friends with, that you hire, one thing that I never really engaged with as much until the last couple of years is how much my life was built around people being able-bodied. People being able to just not even think about if they had to step up 2 steps to enter a restaurant, or go down a flight of stairs to go into it, or thin booths. I was always aware that a lot of restaurants were very thinly spaced, but I used myself as a marker for that. I don't use a mobility device, and I am not particularly big. And even for me, I realized that without always placing how that affected other people and how that affected guests. A lot of times, even when you would instruct hosts or being a host, you look at a reservation and somebody increases it and you think, I can squeeze 6 people in there. And when you do that, you're making an assumption of the bodies of what those people look like. And many of us have done that multiple times. And we're like, well, if it's a big deal, it's a big deal, we'll switch it. But we're not coming at it from the position where we are assuming the actual like access and comfort of people. Often we're assuming they're going to be people more like this quote unquote ideal, and not who our guests likely can be. And as a result, we don't actually end up serving them because we don't create spaces for them. And I identify this as an edge curve because I know that for the first bit, especially when I was throwing events for charitable, I throw a lot of charity events. Someone was like, oh, can you write like the accommodations, like the physical accommodations? And I was like, oh, well, I can't, like, they have to go up a flight of steps to go to it. But basically I just get spaces donated, and I like, and kind of like you just start to do that weird fumbling thing, right? Like what I know in that situation is that I knew that like I had just overseen something. I had a lot of reasons for why I'd overseen it. I was looking for donated spaces. I needed a specific time of the day. I'm in Toronto. It's very hard to have an accessible place in Toronto, almost anywhere. A lot of times, depending on how your building is zoned, it doesn't actually have to ever become accessible. Those are just excuses. Those are excuses where I am now uncomfortable, and I am now making the other person in that conversation have to deal with my personal discomfort at being engaged with on something I oversaw because I was not aware or centering how I could actually be, and I don't like saying an ally, but be in community with somebody else. Instead of actually understanding why I can easily plan many things without thinking about how many events, without thinking about how I was necessarily excluding a lot of people who not only would potentially benefit from the event, but could actually be a patron of the event. I was kind of going into all the reasons why it was unattainable for me to do that. But the problem is that like, I wouldn't have done that if I had found a venue that didn't have an ice machine. Like I wouldn't have done that if I had found a venue that didn't have chairs. I would have either gotten chairs or gotten tables or gotten ice delivered, but I would have seen those as necessary accommodations I had to do. But I didn't see that at the time, or I felt a bit more defensive about it. And defensiveness is something that is often very much in line with people's discomfort. My defensiveness came from not wanting to be a bad person or not wanting to seem not wanting to admit like where I had areas that I wasn't engaging with, where I could include people. This happens a lot in conversations around, especially I find race in hospitality, where often it's brought up by somebody and it becomes about how it was brought up in that moment, if that moment was important enough, or why, rather than engaging with the harm a racialized person felt, why it then becomes this referendum on the person who it's being brought up to, being a manager, an owner, a coworker, why they are actually not a bad person, or why or the basis of the information they made their decision on, without realizing that they made their decision not centering someone who is racialized or people who are basically anything that you want to slot in. Because a lot of times, whether we want to or not, we were trained to envision a certain guest, and we were trained to envision a certain coworker. And we don't always engage with what that looks like and how that looked in the moment, and how we've ingrained that kind of ideal person, this like probably older white male, easily can walk around our restaurant, how we've built our spaces for this person, and what it looks like when we not only say, I don't want to build this space, like I want to change it, I want to have the most queer, ethnic, like class diverse group, but what it actually looks like to live it. And what that looks like to live it sometimes is you move your tables, you change your marketing, you change how you speak, and you understand that you can also make that those mistakes yourself. And I know that there's quite a few like really good questions. So I just kind of wanted to do a little check-in here, because it has been pretty dense and so far. And what I really want to get at this is, and if any of you approached or come to a bunch of my seminars, is I like to give helpful advice. I don't like to give you answers, because I think that sometimes actually I don't think. In hospitality, we tend to hire people and we tend to breed this this environment of being on a checklist. We are so obsessed with time and urgency and just getting it done that sometimes what we end up doing is we end up trying to get to the yes, and maybe we really nail it for 3 months. Like maybe we have the most equal place in the world for 3 months, but because sorry guys, but because we can't actually engage with why and how that can change when we change even 1 or 2 staff members, we can't get to creating an actually safe and good community. So I'm just going to go through some of the questions right now. And yeah, so for this topic, I think I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to pull out different parts of this and put this into slides that will live on my Instagram. They'll live in the feed and in highlights as well. But someone asked, how can we learn more about edge curves, or how can we learn about like discomfort versus harm, and all these different things? I'm going to put up some resources there and also some connections to people too. I also want to really stress that all of this is like a practice, especially for those of you who really want to be part of transformative change in hospitality. I would say probably one of the most disappointing parts of that is like you're probably always going to disappoint yourself. You are almost always going to make mistakes. And then what you're going to learn how to do is identify when you make the mistakes, identify why you're making the mistakes, or what, and that's where something like an edge curve can come into play, because most people make mistakes in patterns. It could just be like, it might be something intangible, or to you it might be intangible, but you might notice patterns of like which types of people you get into conflict with, or when it comes up and you want to figure out how to make it better. And again, I think that if you've ever done the thing where you plot your privileges, I typically dislike saying the word privilege, because I think it's one of those words that people shut down on, even though it's a very true word. But it's not just about if you are straight or if you are a certain race or whatever. Privileges come into a lot of things. It comes into your education background. It comes into say your class background, it comes into your health background, including those around you. Maybe it comes into your appearance. It really it comes into, as we mentioned, like especially like your physical size. It really charts about a lot. The more in a certain area you have a privilege is also an area where you likely have to engage with if you have somewhere that you need to grow there. And also beyond, if you need to grow in that area, looking at what your friend group looks like, looking like what people around it looks like, and looking at if you unconsciously shut people out who do not necessarily reflect you. Just because I am a Black woman doesn't mean that I cannot exercise like class and education bias on people. You see this a lot in, say, front of house spaces where more and more, kind of inexplicably, people have a lot of hiring officers are giving more weight to people who have a bachelor's degree or a master's, even though that probably has almost nothing to do with the actual task of what they need to do, say if they are a server. That in and of itself is often an exercising of class and education privilege, and also shutting out some people, and often is used to recreate barriers to upward mobility for others. So I'd say for me, it's not so much just about, well, I'm a Black woman who's done all these certifications and went to university, how come people don't give me a raise? It's also about engaging with the idea, like why all of a sudden it seems that in order to have upward mobility in what is typically a hospitality or a career path that is really relied on interpersonal skills and a decent amount of physical prowess as well, we've now started to almost shift our industry into this ever whitening middle class space if you want upward mobility. So plotting where you are, plotting where your friends are, and in plotting where your community is, and seeing how that might inform your biases is also something that can be really helpful, especially if you're trying to be more aware of where you might not be engaging, but also where you're trying to be aware of where you might, in a conflict situation, react more from defensiveness or your personal discomfort rather than you actually being harmed. You feeling like you need to grow somewhere doesn't always mean somebody did something to you. You not being prepared for a conversation isn't the same as you being harmed or somebody blindsiding you. And to flip it as well, someone not necessarily having the best word or tone for how they're addressing you is not equal to, say, if you actually hurt them. If they're trying to address, say, a racial harm or a situation in which they were made to be unsafe, say if it was with a guest, say if a guest was very upset about a mask policy and you kind of swooped in as a savior, but in a way that was very dismissive to that staff's personal experience. If they're trying to address with you, sometimes our staff, or sometimes we don't always have the most delicate words, but it's also a way of pushing past, is it the tone I don't like, or is it actually, or am I actually paying attention to the words? If tone becomes synonymous with harm, then what we are often doing is playing into the same power structures we say we don't want to, because those are the same things that many people in authority use to keep others from being able to access, or to be able to advocate for themselves. We say they were too rude about it. They were too loud about it. I didn't like how they went about it. Generally speaking, if you're going to agitate in a system, if the system isn't created for you, if it discriminates against you, that system isn't usually only going to listen when you speak quietly and patiently. And that's why when many of us share themes like, or share slogans from marches that say, no justice, no peace, I don't know if everyone really understands what that means. So I'm going to put in some questions if you haven't already. I'm going to get to them, but I'm just going to end on one thing, and hopefully this has been helpful so far. And I really want to end on something that if any of you follow me, I mentioned last night in my stories, which is part of the way that you get better at differentiating between if a conversation is something that is inherently harmful to you, or if it's only something that is making you uncomfortable, whether or not there's a conflict that is healthy or a conflict that is inherently unsafe. Sometimes, and it's something that I do, and this can be very uncomfortable for people, is I practice saying it. And I also do that with infographics on Instagram or different terminology I hear. I practice saying it, I practice using it in a sentence, and I practice saying it with different people. And I'm saying this because I think we've been kept from each other, and that's a big part of COVID. And it is traumatic to be kept from different people. There's a lot of conversation around how many of us have almost no empathy for those who found themselves in the prison carceral system. But 3 months of not being able to see loved ones, and many of us will need years of therapy. So I would really say to all of that is, we've often, in the last year and a bit, between various civil rights movements, various different conversations about health, even about the consent and talking between staff members to each other. Like, when have you ever really had to even feel lightly pressured that you had to tell a staff member that you might have seen your mom because they might see their mom and you might give them something? So we have this whole new world of communication, and we're absorbing so much. We're learning so much about what is good, what is bad, what is healthy, that I think we're often sharing information and absorbing it at this rapid pace, but we're not actually processing it. So one thing I put in my stories that I really would recommend people to do is, before you read something and you say that makes sense, and like, we're going to use as an example for us in Canada, with the discovery of the mass grave at the Kamloops residential school. I see a lot of people sharing a lot of slides and really great information by really great, mostly Indigenous scholars and advocates on how to just stand up and be there for the people in the Indigenous community. But a lot of it is using terminology that I know like people would never say out loud. And I say that because if you're going to share something, it's not just about thinking something makes sense. It's also about knowing if you can even apply it in a sentence in your life. You can even say it out loud. So I'd say, every time you see something, say about like a Black Lives Matters or it's Pride Month, about Pride, see if you can say it out loud and how comfortably you'd say that to, and ask yourself who you'd say it to. And that doesn't mean you can never share it. There's some company that like, maybe it's not worth the fight to you that moment with your great grandmother who you haven't seen in a year. But it is something to like really check in with yourself about whether you're just regurgitating information or whether it's something that you can truly process, because then it doesn't mean that you're not supposed to find it interesting, but then you have to shift your idea, like where you are from that of like a mouthpiece and potentially trying to look like somebody who's already on the right side of history, to where you're like, well, I've identified this is something I want to embody, I want to understand, but I've also identified that it is hard for me to say it or live it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to practice it. I'm going to practice talking about it in conversation with somebody who makes me feel safe. I'm going to read more about it so that if somebody says, why do you keep saying settler? I'm going to have an answer for them. And I'm not going to just shut down. I'm not going to just stop it and then pretend it was just a mistake, right? There's all these different ways in which we engage in our community and our ideas. And that doesn't mean that you're going to be this like, quote unquote, perfect person. I think what we should all try to get to is to be a more like authentic and thoughtful version of ourselves in a way that doesn't potentially exacerbate hurt or harm for other people. And that's why really seeing where your privileges, quote unquote, lie, and really starting to differentiate between whether a situation is inherently harmful, is it actually perpetuating true harm to somebody, or is it something that is more making me uncomfortable? And it could be for any number of reasons. It could be on your insecurity. It could be something that you've really never thought about before. It could be something that is a bit of a sore spot for you. It could be something that would be very hard for you to restructure, and as such is an existential issue. For example, it might be really hard for you to restructure your pay structure at work. So rather than having that conversation, maybe you shut down and you think you're being attacked. So all of these are just ways in which, as you do those check-ins, and I think for COVID, we're going to have these hard conversations pretty constantly. As you do those check-ins with each other at your work, you should do those check-ins with yourself. And ideally, you can find a friend or two who are good for you to like bounce off of, because a lot of these feelings and a lot of these things are messy. And if you left here with anything, what I want to just give people is this permission that as you navigate a reopen, the healthiest reopen will likely have some manner of messy conversation, because you cannot get to real change and growth if you think it's going to be a road with absolutely no conflict and no situations of like nothing that will, sorry, I lived in downtown Toronto, but basically you're never going to grow if you aren't willing to feel some pain along the line. It's the same if you work out and you try to build muscle, as cliche as that is, but it is very true. If you think you're going to radically change how hospitality is, make everything more equal, but you're going to not have a single fight, you're not going to lose a single supplier, and you're not even going to have a weird, awkward conversation, even by yourself with yourself, then you're not going to change anything. You're just going to maintain the status quo, but you're going to maintain the status quo with co-opting some language along the way. And you don't want to be someone who co-opts language. If you use it, and again, you don't have to use it. I use privilege in this talk. Some talks I actively avoid it. I shift language I use depending on where I'm at, but I know the language that I need to use for myself, and it doesn't shift in order to signify signify anything to anyone. I think that's just like the best place for you to end. And ideally, that's just what you could get from here, which is like the permission in your workplaces with yourselves to like advocate to be a little bit uncomfortable, if that means creating something that is a lot safer for everyone overall. So yeah, I'm going to look at some questions now, and hopefully that was helpful to everyone. I know it's been 45 minutes so far, and we're supposed to wrap up at the hour. But yeah, so here's one. How do you overcome a situation when someone that's hurt you won't apologize or take accountability for their actions? So that's a good one, because I think that's probably the most common one to happen. Accountability is something that I think, or I don't like, a lot of people find very hard, because we are trained, and we train ourselves often to think on a binary. People are either good or they're bad. And then if people meant well, if they had good intentions, then pointing out that they perhaps made a mistake to them, again, is flattening of this idea of accountability into this idea of an attack. So how do you overcome the situation? So I think there's a few layers to this. And this works on both sides, right? This works on if somebody is like, you hurt me, and if you're having a hard time getting to where you need to either apologize or take accountability, or you're not understanding how this conversation is actually going to go. So there's a couple of things. And one I think is you always have to engage with whether or not the situation is something that you need to be in. A lot of times we do not give ourselves enough permission to leave a situation that is inherently unsafe, or the other person will not have a vested interest in you. Sometimes situations can resolve themselves. They don't always resolve themselves with everyone still in the same roles with each other. So that's just one thing. It's one, like, it's, if someone is in direct relationship to you, say in a workplace, sometimes that can be reconciled through the use of a mediator or different rules at work. Sometimes somebody has to be out of that environment. But in that, I think it's very important that you still create boundaries around it. You should be very clear about where exactly you think the harm was, and also what you want from it. A lot of us think of apologies as, or really our relationships, it's like this binary, and it's like this like tick sheet. It's, I apologize this time, or I apologize once, I'm not going to do it again. But often the apology isn't based in anything that's like, it's almost like transactionary. So I would also ask you, when you're looking at the situation, are you looking at like the balancing of a ledger sheet, or are you looking at the building of a relationship? or something that would allow you to be in a space safely. So if you have to stay in the situation, right, I would say make sure you have boundaries with that person. Those boundaries could be a number of different things. It could be making sure that you establish what your facts of the situation are, knowing what you would need in order for it to be reconciled. For example, it could be, I need an apology, or it could be going forward, when we engage on this, I will not engage with you on this topic again, or I'd rather go through our direct superior. It could be something like that. Being able, and this is hard for people, but if you are able to create a boundary and if you can stick to that boundary, that is not only something that can be very helpful for you, it's also something that will like protect you going forward from potential harm from this person. Many people, they don't want to take accountability for something, they'll often press in different ways in order to almost like slip you up. You don't have to engage, and you also don't have to accept apologies either. Not necessarily taking and accepting apology doesn't mean that you're always going to be antagonistic. It just, sometimes that's also not what somebody needs. Sometimes all you need is somebody to acknowledge that they harmed you, and you could say that their relationship with them, especially this work relationship, is going to be different going forward. It doesn't have to go back to where it is, and then you can leave it at that. But I think the biggest thing for a person who's in the middle of that situation is really figuring out what your boundaries are with yourself and with that person. And also, and this is what can be hard, is how much of that is endemic to your work situation and how much of it is that the other person in particular. Like if it's at work, what else in that system is, how is management or other ownership, or if it is management ownership, how are they ever going to hold themselves accountable? Is there somebody else who can be part of it? Or is it playing into a system where this other person will essentially be able to repeat the same action over and over again with different people, because it's not seen as a core value of that place? A lot of our hospitality spaces, we talk about our core values, but a lot of times those core values don't translate into like how we interact with each other, and especially how we navigate our conflict, and they really should, how we want to end. So hopefully that is helpful to that question. I'd say, and then, but that's a really good question because it's also quite hard. I'd say on the flip side of that is like, how do you engage with somebody saying that they've been hurt by you? Like, how do you engage with that? Because for a lot of us, especially a lot of this work is very personal. So for many of us, almost we react defensively, and we often also will tend to react like a fact checker. And this fact checker can operate in many different ways. Sometimes this fact checker is like, well, you came at it the wrong way, or you did all these other things. And like, you almost kind of like have your receipts for this person, and you're doing it in a way to distract from what is actually happening in that situation. So maybe somebody is saying they were harmed because in the middle of, maybe they thought that you did something that revealed like a bias. Like, let's say, because I've actually heard this happen quite a bit at different places. Let's say that like they thought that you assumed too many times that the brown guy that walks in works for Uber, and it's not somebody there to like buy his own pickup, and tries to engage with that. But maybe this person who's bringing it up to you is also like a worker who maybe isn't your ideal worker in a lot of other ways. A lot of times, many people's defense mechanism is, well, if you're going to criticize what I do, I'm going to bring up what you do wrong. So I'm going to say, well, you're often late to work, or you're not on top of all your knowledge specs and everything. So how could you be saying that I could potentially be making this like mistake when actually you're the one who's often in the wrong? And there's a few things that is often this power balance. One of the first things is sometimes you're conflating criticism of you that could actually speak to direct, true global harms, things like racism, sexism, transphobia, fatphobia, and we're mistaking that as like a professional critique, and we're responding with professional critiques. This happens a lot. Like, why are you saying this to me? I'm doing such a good job, without engaging with like the one thing that I am being critiqued on is actually something that is not a small mistake. It's like a systemic mistake. And the fact that I'm thinking that it's an afterthought reveals a lot more of my thought patterns. If I'm going to brush off somebody saying that I acted out of misogyny or I acted out of racism, then what I'm likely doing is I'm like, well, I can't be that because this is not something that I'm going to even engage with. I'm going to say it's the exact same as you being late to work, or it's the exact same as you sometimes being a little bit short when you're distracted. It's not the same thing. And when you want to be a leader, or even if you just want to be a good partner to somebody in really any kind of partnership, even friendship, is when somebody is explaining that you harmed them, you have to just listen, and you can potentially ask questions to learn, but you shouldn't be asking questions to essentially gotcha. This isn't a court case. You're not trying to be you're not at like the majority of guilt, right? Like you are ideally trying to engage in actual human interactions. And if you treat it like this, like ledger or this binary, or well, you're saying something to me, but I'm going to be sensitive about it, or I don't think you have a place, rather than engaging with the fact that you potentially actually harm somebody, and for somebody to name that is a big deal, then you are never really going to be a good leader or a great partner to that person, because you are not able to be accountable. You can't be accountable for something if you don't even want to listen to it. So I would put that for a lot of us, because I think especially with all the stress about like money and reopens and opens and closures, and I don't know how many of you have had to fire people so many times or be fired yourself so many times. I think many of us, like, we are conflating any criticism with attacks, and as a result, it's making it very hard for us to truly be accountable to each other, because all we want to do is just get to the other side. And then somebody did ask about, say, over-serving guests too, because I think this is a big thing, and that it's going to be a big part of what we do. And the next bit, we've probably always had to cut off people. There could be multiple seminars on the beautiful ways to cut off somebody without getting into a physical altercation. I would say communication in the next bit, and this is what this all comes down to, is going to be incredibly paramount for essentially forever. It was always paramount. We are literally in the business of making people happy while also using a lot of our creative talents and this multi-sensory experience, from the tastes of our drinks to the food, to the design, to the sound. Like, we are all about engaging with people's senses, which means that sometimes people are going to engage too much. I would say that when it comes to cutting off people, for example, people being entitled, it's always better to be proactive than to avoid the conflict and then wait till it very much escalates. This is basically always true when people are drinking. It's better to say, slow people down in the initial part, rather than being like, well, if they're too drunk, then I'll just cut them off eventually, when you already know that they're down that line. Generally speaking, proactive communication might not avoid a conflict, but it tends to lead to less explosive conflicts. And right now we have a lot of people in our society that are wound up because all they've been told is no, and they've lost a lot. And probably they're just waiting for the one person that they're allowed to yell at. And unfortunately, in hospitality, that's a lot of us. People have definitely been told they can yell at their servers, their bartenders, the busser at the wedding, like, because we're disposable. So knowing how we can also navigate that to protect ourselves, navigating that to not wait for an explosion, but to essentially try to cut off something before it gets to that point, is very important. But it is hard too, because you have to manage that with money and all those other things. But I think proactive communication, and communication that checks in with you, and also you can check in with your coworkers. You can say, I'm feeling very activated by a situation right now, or I'm not going to handle this well. And you can and should pass that off to somebody if they are able to handle it better too. All right. Did anyone have any questions or comments, or did I say anything that anyone needs any kind of clarifications on? I'm just kind of looking at names, so it can be a little bit hard, and I want to make sure that everything is kind of sorted. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, or no, there's actually a few things. There's a few ways that people can get at me. And so I know that Sovereign Canada has recorded this conversation. I'll be talking to them about how they're going to share it. I'm also going to be, as I mentioned, pulling out a few different things, basically about how to differentiate between harm and discomfort, how to navigate conflict, and how to look at conflict not as a bad, but as something that is necessary for the growth, for growth in your place, and for growth essentially in your life in general. So I'll be putting all that up on my personal IG over the next bit. And I just really do want to, I don't know, just so I don't overstay, but I really do want to say that I appreciate having the chance to talk about this. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a very big, long conversation, and it hits on a lot of different things, but I also think it hits on something that in Canada specifically, and in hospitality in general, we don't engage enough about, which is how much we potentially harm each other by avoiding conflict, and also how much sometimes we lie to each other that we are avoiding conflict. And really what we do is we put that onus on the ones who are less able to advocate for themselves. And that's why we often have very homogenous places of work to begin with. So I want to thank you all. If you have any questions, you can always find me on Instagram, or you can email me as well. My personal email is linked on my Instagram. So it's just Christina Veira .pt@gmail.com. I think Evan wants to do a little sign off.
I just want to, from Sovereign Canada, I just want to thank you for hosting. I'm sorry I wasn't able to pop in the beginning and introduce you. All of Dartmouth lost power about 20 minutes before the seminar started. So classic Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. But yeah, so just thank you so much for doing this and being a part of this conversation and being a leader in Canada. So just thank you so much.
Thank you all. And again, if there's anything that I said, especially if you're like in terms of like weird edge curves, or like if there's something you're like, I don't want to ask you right now and be put on the spot, but like there's something you said that it didn't like sit right with me, that is also something I want to hear about too, because being clearer in the communication, or also finding ways in which it could be better for others, is important, not only like to me personally, but like in general in this work. So I want people to feel that transparency too. So yeah, thank you all so much. And thank you, Evan, and thank you, Sovereign. So I guess we had like 30 something people in the chat. So there'll be $150 odd going to Nelly Shelter in Toronto. And then I will be matching that with $150 odd, whatever that odd ends up being. I'm promising I'm not trying to be vague. We'll be going to the Indian Residential Schools Survivor Society. And I'm gonna ideally earmark that to their elder support network. But I'll let you all know that too on the internets.
Thank you, everyone. I hope everyone has a good day, and thank you, Christina, again.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.